Loud and clear, Hannes. Good morning, good afternoon.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah, sounds good.
Hey, Rifat, thanks for joining. Hey, Steve. Let's give folks a few minutes to join. Do it so, and then we can get started.
Just, Hannes, can you confirm you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, great. For some reason, this one is more nuanced in how it likes devices.
Greetings, everyone from Seattle.
Hannes, were you pleased with the outcome of the U.S. Super Bowl?
Well, I think I would be the wrong person to do that, right?
It was a nail biter right to the very end. I will give it that.
I thought you'd be the least objective, so I thought I'd give you the first shot.
I do have relatives in Kansas. Yeah. I do have relatives in Kansas City who were very pleased yesterday.
Yeah, I have to say there was a scary moment there when Mahomes' ankle kicked out on him. That could have changed the whole game.
So I guess you all watched it, and it was super exciting.
It was on in the background.
Eating food while it's on in the background is the balance.
The ads were pretty good too.
I'm just glad we're not meeting in Philadelphia this week.
That would not be good, yes.
Yeah.
You had proposed some agenda items.
Give me 1 more minute for coffee, and then we get started.
All right.
Fair enough.
Okay, perfect. Who is going to take the meeting minutes today? Is it a sort of combo K and Kieran, or?
Taking notes today. This is Kieran.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks a lot. I see Monty as well and Rifat. So we have 2 topics on today's agenda. As we discussed last week, we want to wrap up or get a first version of the use case document out. And then the second item is we wanted to talk about identity management, since it was brought up or requested by Ray last week, and then 2 weeks ago or so when we talked about Sigstore, Zachary gave a presentation or talked about it. We also spoke about OpenID Connect and the role of it for user and sort of workload / process authentication. Okay, let's start quickly with the use cases. Hank or anyone who is going to give a quick update and an introduction also, or a segue into the discussion about the OpenPR.
Yeah, I can give.
Cool,
This is your,
do it.
yeah. So basically, There were few open issues as we discussed on last Monday. There were multiple issues open, so we tidied up all the issues. There were two minor suggestions from Dick. We incorporated that, and thanks to Kiran and Cake to kind of stepping in and helping us out, me and Hank. So Kiran produced a PR, two PRs. One was improvements on the Dick suggestions, and then second, tidying up a bit of harmonization efforts to look the language consistent across all sections of the document. And we had a couple of brainstorming meeting between me, Hank, Kiran, and then we ironed it out and pipe cleaned all the pending items. And thanks to, I think, there was one contributor who contributed to some of the spelling corrections also. So I wanted to say thanks to that also. By and large, most of the 95% of these things are done now. The document is in a good state. Only pending is Monty's use case, which we had a meeting on Friday as well for that. And we have some open action items or open questions for Monty. And once we address that, we can merge Monty's PR as well into that to complete the document. Only another thing is the to-do items, which I think might have slipped in there. We need to discuss that as well. There are few which we have already closed, and few I don't think we should wait till and we can freeze the document this week. We can move those to-do items for future actions or future work items post the IETF. But I think the document is in a good shape post Monty's PR merge to have it asking for a call for adoption.
Well, like first we need to have the submission of the document. So do you want to share the screen to, or otherwise talk about the open issues regarding the PR? Because it would be great if we could merge that PR and then ship the document, right? Because it looks like while you had some discussions but you also have proposals in there and so on, it doesn't look like you are too far off from really sort of like getting a first version out there.
Yeah, I can do that. I have requested you for permission of sharing my screen.
Okay, got it.
Hannes.
Oh, Hank, do you want to say something as well?
Yeah, I wanted to give him opportunity to say something from Hank as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So ideally we would have. Hi everybody, this is Hank. Ideally we would have already merged this. There are two things here stopping us from that. That one of the things is that Monty is a global citizen and traveling the world and was not available last week. So that's one thing. We couldn't just merge it without the original contributors' consensus. But he's here with us now. And there are two open items, suggestions from Ori, actually, that to our point of view would have changed the fundamental meaning of the use case. And so we were hesitant to pull these two suggestions in. I pinged Ori, but he does not seem to be available at this time right now. So so this, I think the harder part is, or maybe the more complex part is to go through all the items with Monty today and look where we're at, and then resolve the two items from Ori after this meeting. And then I think we are basically there, as Hannes, as you highlighted.
So here is the PR where we have some open items. So shall we go ahead and start working on those? Monty, you're there?
Yes, I'm here. And I apologize. I was out in Taiwan for the last week and kind of ignoring everything else that's going on in the world. So apologies, I haven't kept up.
Yeah. So initially, I kind of reworded Hank's proposal for having title as verifying firmware provenance for large and complex systems. But Hank has a point that we should make it more clear as to what exactly is this different from other use cases. So I think maybe we wanted to add the point about after the fact something. So I wanted to make sure I'm capturing the right title of your PR.
Well, what would be the alternative title?
Yeah, yeah.
like it better has something in there with firmware because. But,
Of course, that is.
Yeah, and the difference I'm trying to, well, the difference this use case in particular, as opposed to the other side of use cases, is you typically check the provenance, the integrity, the ownership, whatever you want to call it, of the component. Typically, you would do that prior to launching it. So, is this okay? For example, checking the signature, checking it against the manifest, whatever. But that's typically done before you launch something. Firmware is different. You only get to look at the artifacts that are left after it executes. And if I'm understanding, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the concern or question, that's the point I'm trying to get across here, is that it's after the fact, not before the fact.
Yeah, one question here, Monty, which I was discussing with Hank last week as well. So, isn't the case that you're trying to highlight a case of specific firmware which you cannot, before it runs in the memory, you cannot check before the execution that it is present in a transparency service, the manifest, or any metadata about that? Is that what you're trying to say here?
Well, typically not. I mean, unless the firmware's fairly complex, it doesn't have an internet connection. The best it would have is a signature. That's the best it would have. But for example, classic example I give is if a BIOS vendor, just the example is UEFI, their version 1.03, just making up versions, 1.03, which was signed by a particular key, had a vulnerability in it. And then they released 1.04. Normally, under this sort of scenario, you could look at a manifest if it was a runtime OS present environment. You might be able to look at a manifest and say, oh yeah, even though it's signed by the same thing, exchanging signature keys, especially in firmware, is extremely expensive, and you typically don't do it. Even at OS present, swapping out signatures and updating signatures is extremely expensive. So what you might do, though, is look at a manifest and say, oh, 1.03 has got a vulnerability. I don't want to do that. 1.04 is okay, right? Well, you can't do that sort of analysis in the firmware, right? So the best you have is some provenance of the module, but that provenance is very coarse-grained, where, like I said, you're not going to swap out the signatures. So you might know where it came from, but you don't necessarily know if it's got a vulnerability or not in this particular case. Whereas after boot, you would know because the actual binary is measured. Right, you'd be able to look after the fact, but not before the fact.
Before you, Monty, you dig deep into this, we have 3 people on the queue, and I'm still trying to find out what the alternative subject heading is. But Dick,
sure.
you're the first one in the queue. Give those guys a chance as well.
Thank you, Hannes. So I'd just like to say that I concur with Hank and Yogesh with regard to the 2 use cases that I contributed to. I think those are accurately depicted in scope for what we hope to achieve with SCITT. With regard to the firmware question, I guess I wonder how that would actually, be manifest. Would, for example, a MUD object be registered in a SCITT registry, or would a suit artifact be registered? Would that achieve what you're going after here, Monty?
I'm not familiar with either of those particular technologies, so I don't think I can properly answer the question without a little more background.
But I might help you, Monty. So yes, the suit stuff is basically your firmware with instruction how to install it. So it's a guidance, including the firmware itself, like a super endorsement that's packaging it all. And the MUD is basically a URL that points a file that you control and helps you to discover, for example, that endorsement, that RIM, or that suit package that we just mentioned. So in general, Dick, I would say the answer is yes. That's not how it's typically done in that realm today. But yes, definitely that is the improvement we're targeting, and all other options, of course, because we won't want to be excluding anything that is used today.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Given
I guess
that, I agree with Hank's assessment.
yeah. So in that case, it seems like we may already have these covered if
Yeah.
indeed we're going to support the existing IETF standards as part of these attestations, which I think Mud and Suit would qualify as. Then would you say that we are covering this already?
So that is not only Mud and Suit, it's also the COREM work in RATS, for example. That is the equivalent to endorsement for TCG technologies such as DICE and other remote attestation formats like the platform security architecture from ARM. And so that's things that will also go on to the transparency service and be discoverable via that. So again, multiple ways. And I think the really important part here that Monty is trying to phrase with this use case is the typically you have all that beforehand. It's really, really important that systems get this also after the fact, and also really long after the fact. And I think that's sometimes a thing that you oversee, because measure and execute is the standard way to do this remote attestation stuff. But in this case, you do things first, and then in hindsight, you need these records, and from a trustworthy and transparent source, and that would be SCITT fueled. So I think, yes, all these building blocks can contribute to that solution, but SCITT is effectively enabling that and binding it together.
Yeah, my objective of the use case is to make sure this is not this sort of model is not excluded, right? That we can continue to, that the SCITT would in fact support this. Not that I think it's a radical departure, except for the timing of how the manifests are represented and signed. I don't think there's any architectural difference. But I just wanted to make sure that the after the fact verification was at least permitted, if not accommodated, in SCITT was the purpose of writing this.
Thanks, Monty. Steve is next in the queue.
I was thinking this through, and I think about this as, what are the problems we have today in the use cases, and what are the opportunities that SCITT supports? Because obviously we want to do things after the fact on any one of the circumstances, whether it be containers, bootable devices, or any piece of software on a computer or a phone or other IoT device. I think the question of being able to do things beforehand is also kind of relevant. So are we looking at this firmware use case to also highlight another example of an environment that is not connected to the internet when the update is being applied, because it's somewhat sideloaded, staged, but there's a process that goes in before that would be done in the first place, right? Because a firmware update is initiated outside of the firmware update process, and that's where you would go and verify, is this the latest? Is it the latest, but it doesn't have a vulnerability, so I should skip it? So I wonder if this one is another one of those reinforcements of, here's what's done today, here's the problem, and here's an opportunity for SCITT to solve that preloading, the Trojan horse problem, and the post-verification step.
Yeah, I would agree.
Cool. Charles?
Thanks, Hannes. I'm just scratching my head a little here about how this differs from the other use cases.
Yeah.
I have no objection to it, certainly, but I guess I'm trying to understand what we're getting at here. Is this in the context of, I mean, who's maintaining SCITT in this case? Who is the kind of the neutral third party, or how does that? How do I know that the SCITT certifications are reliable?
I mean, if you think about the who owns the device, the firmware is being updated. That's like one place that I would think to go to for an authority.
Yeah, me
the
too.
whole
So
idea
It could
is
easily
that-
start with the manufacturer, but
Yep.
it could also start with, I know there's a number of companies, I won't name them, but at least one or two out there that actually do analysis of firmware and specific firmware updates. And they will do analysis for companies for hire. And they will look at a particular firmware and even a particular firmware version. And they might, as a third party, say, okay, here, this one company, even within this one model, has released 5 updates to their firmware. This is the one I've looked at. Maybe it's the middle one, right? This is the one I've looked at. I haven't looked at the other ones, but somebody paid me, for example, to look at the third one. So I will stick this on this chain. That would be an example of a third party coming along. Maybe they don't have the source code. Maybe they've done penetration testing. They've done other things, right? So one source, the original source will be the manufacturer, but another source might be a third party, either hired or voluntarily done so to evaluate a particular firmware update in this example.
okay, and so with that said, they provide what data structure in SCITT? The endorsement?
I don't know. We haven't gotten into formats yet, right?
Okay.
I just want to make sure that I want to make sure that use case is covered. That's the whole point.
Right. Sure.
That we think about that.
Yeah. Just kind of think it through. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I feel like that use case is definitely covered.
Yeah, I felt that as well, because unless we say that we are targeting a specific section of firmwares which we cannot do any kind of querying to the SCITT or some kind of a transparency service before it runs. If there are use cases where we cannot do that, then we can add this as a has to do and after the loading and running analysis. But
so that's actually what I was going to suggest. I think is unique about this one is it's a sort of hybrid air gap environment, right? Because we've got the ones where they're operating completely in air gap and you have data diodes to get information in and not out. But this one is in a situation where you are connected to some network. I won't weigh into which network, and you should be analyzing whether you should proceed with the update. But then the update itself continues. What, if anything, does SCITT provide that says when the thing goes from some level of connectivity to no connectivity? Is there some assumption of a verification that's done that SCITT can provide, or the content that's in SCITT? Or is it a post step when the thing comes out of this, secluded, isolated environment and comes back and says, yep, I've now been updated and my update is what it was supposed to be. Whether it's vulnerable or not is a different question, but at least there's a check. So it's connected, not connected, reconnected. Is that a unique scenario around the firmware use case?
I think it is. And again, I guess kind of my justification for including this, even though we might end up agreeing that this is already covered. We've been talking for 20 minutes, and the experts in the room, literally the experts in the room, are discussing this. And to me, having a use case like this in there makes it obvious that the experts in the room think that this is covered, as opposed to a year down the road, 18 months down the road, someone says a whole new group of people join up. That's my litmus test. We all win we all get hit by the lottery because we all bought a lottery ticket and we're all gone. The next group of people come along and have the same debate. I'm trying to avoid that.
Yeah, for that reason, I totally agree. Yeah, Monty, I think you're right.
That's what I'm trying to accomplish, making it obvious that this is intended to be covered.
Yep.
Steve, are you still in the queue? Do you want to?
I am, Hannes. I am, Hannes. I was just going to say, I think the multi-stakeholder use case sounds like we may be covering most of what Monty's looking for. So my question really is there something we could do to 3.2 that would ensure that Monty's concerns are addressed?
Oh, I
see. It sounds
see.
very similar, Monty.
Yeah.
You were talking about multiple parties, and that one's
Yep.
there. So maybe there's something we can tweak in 3.2 that would address your concerns.
That would specifically include third party.
You know, that's already there,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
I don't recall writing it in
No.
my use case in particular, but if it's already there in the primary, you know, I guess my use case kind of inherits that capability. But you're right, maybe we should include that as a reference.
Yeah, if there's something we can do that makes, that makes your case, relevant here, then I think we should be able to accommodate that, because a lot of what you were describing with the multiple stakeholders involved is really embedded in that use case.
It would, or yeah, right. Or I could specifically call it out in the use case and point to section 3.3, right? As that's intended to be included. I don't, just as we're scrolling through here, I don't see anything that would exclude that, but we should specifically mention it. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And Monty, I would like to say, request please go through 3.7 also. Maybe if we can cover your firmware delivery use cases with the set of constraint device use case we have, and what 3.2 and 3.7 could thus together address the points you are trying to highlight in your pull request. If they are covered, then yeah. So sorry. So that
So
might
I'll take the action to look at 3.3
yes,
3.3 and reconcile that with 3.6. Yeah.
3.3 and 3.7. If you could please have a look.
3.3 and 3.7.
Then we can say
Ray is also in the queue. Let him say the last few words, and then we cut the line here.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I want to say that I'm happy to see that this air gapped mode of but after the fact confirmation that the firmware is correct and really any data is correct will really fulfill the issues that I had with it. It's the same use case essentially as this voting machine data, election data use case. So happy to see that that's in there, and I don't see any reason it can't be supported by the architecture we have in mind, at least what I think we have in mind. And so yeah, I'm happy that that's in there and it's covering what I was thinking I needed. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. So from what I hear, here's what I would propose, and John, please pile onto it. I would say Monty is going to look at that BR a little bit more. We let kind of like cook it a little bit more, but take the current document. If you sort of move as Yogesh, as you said initially at the beginning of the meeting, take the to-do list and move that into the GitHub issue tracker, and then also add the missing figure. I don't think it should take too long to do that, and then go ahead and submit the document as is, and then we have a sort of a snapshot, which I think is nicely readable, and then we obviously go from there. Like this is not the final version, but we have something out there that we can sort of go through and add something and tweak and so on. But I think it's a good initial version.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you can do that ASAP. John, do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is what we asked for last week. I think we've had the requisite action, so let's get this merged and ready.
Yeah. Please, Yogesh, or whoever is adding the figure, should be too complicated. I know you have the figure ready in like vector graphic also, but create an ASCII art and be done with it. And then we can go from there.
So what was the original picture? I was trying to figure it out. Brian, you had added some picture. Is Brian here?
Send it around.
Yeah, I mean, is that the picture we are referring here to be added, right? Just confirming once.
I can certainly add it, and
Yeah.
you know, if there's additional changes, happy to incorporate those.
Yeah, if you could please add the pictures, and I will do the to-do list items and review them, and whatever are still relevant, move it to issues and delete the to-do section. I will do that bit. If you already have the picture ready, by all means, please create a PR with the addition of picture, and I will be happy to look at it and review it.
I will do that. Thank you,
Yeah.
Yogesh.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Yogesh. Dick, if it's still on this topic, I would like to move over to the identity management, because we invited Rifat to join us today to talk about this identity management topic. Dick, is that already to the next topic, or you want to say something to the use case document?
Yeah, no, Hannes, I was just going to say, you know, I'm happy to help out with the graphics, but I will tell you that those line art graphics are incredibly difficult to create. So if there's an easier way to do it, I'm happy to contribute. Thanks.
Yeah, there's an easy way, and I post a link into the chat window there. Tools to draw ASCII art. So give me a few minutes, and then I'll send it over there. Okay.
Okay. And I was just going to say, so Brian, if you're taking the lead, just look at me as a resource to delegate to. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the quick reaction time on that document. So next topic, Rifat. Thanks for joining. And sorry to let you wait like 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. So Rifat co-chairs the OWASP working group. And so he also works for a company selling identity management solutions. So he's obviously familiar with this topic. And I will try to provide a short introduction for him on what we have been talking about and why we want to talk about this topic in the first place. Is we have this ledger, call it the distributed database append-only log, where so-called artifacts that may be anything from a software bill of material, it may be a report of a static analysis, code analysis tool, or whatever is put into that ledger. And of course, the person signing that information also needs to is obviously his or her identity, or in case of a process, its identity is obviously quite important for the overall process to know what is actually, or whether the content that is in that ledger can be sort of, in quotes, trusted, or it has a certain meaning if, let's say, a big well-known corporation with a long track record of providing high-quality software has put something into that ledger and confirms I created this bootloader operating system or whatever. It's actually coming from a specific source. And that requires some form of identity management solution, ideally that is global, scalable, and sort of does the usual things that one would expect. And we had, in context of SIGSTOR, we had a discussion about what SIGSTOR uses currently, which is OpenID Connect. And but there were also questions raised about the quality of the authentication, whether information about what level of authentication was provided can actually be conveyed, and so on. And so I see the queue is already building up, probably adding questions to that. But maybe you can say a few words about, to start somewhere, about OpenID Connect and how it is used, or in specifically like for the authentication aspects, and what identifiers it uses, and how some of that information about what the quality of the authentication was.
Are you asking me, Hannes?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, like OpenID defines specific parameters to allow you to provide information about the authentication class, reference, and another parameter around AMR, or authentication methods references. So these are methods already kind of baked into OpenID Connect. So when you authenticate the user with AMR, you will be able to obtain a specific value that will indicate the level of authentication that was done in the ID token, right? So that's one option. Another is to use the ACR value, which allows the client to indicate, hey, I'd like a specific level of assurance for authentication, and you'll get that response again in the ID token. So these are baked in well-known mechanisms that are already in OpenID Connect. There's also another document being discussed right now with the OAuth work group around step-up authentication. So if that is needed, that would probably be helpful there. So if you access a resource and that resource is, for example, wants to indicate that it wants a higher level of assurance, you'll be able to kind of reply again and indicate that level of assurance it needs. And then the user will go back and authenticate, get a new token, and then come back with those details. So again, without really kind of understanding the context of those use cases that you guys have, I can't obviously talk about the specifics, but from a protocols perspective, those mechanisms already exist, and hopefully you can utilize them instead of inventing something new, right? Does that help, Hannes?
Definitely, it's a good start, and having two people in the queue already, that helps. Steve.
I was going to just say that one of the things that I think we're trying to accomplish is varied different types of identities, right? This is the concept of the distributed identities, is that certain, as you're traveling around the world, you have a certain types of identity that allow you to go to certain places and are allowed by certain entities. And I think that's the model that we're shooting here for, whether it be, whatever we consider a super strong identity, or might be a weak identity. I think that's up to the consumer or up to the SCITT ledger to decide whether they accept that identity type or even that specific identity. So that allows instances that run a SCITT instance or consumers of that SCITT instance to make decisions based on that identity and type of identity. So I don't think it's any more exclusatory, as opposed to one of the key pieces I think we've said we want to do in SCITT is as something's applied, that there is a policy and a registration policy that allows the owner of that SCITT instance to, one, go verify that identity is valid at that point in time, just like a notary does when you go and try to sign a contract, and then can decide whether that identity and identity type are applicable to that type of operation, the statement that they're trying to make. So I think that the details give us the flexibility in it to let an operator decide whether they want a weak or strong identity for a particular scenario.
Okay. I'll definitely pick up on that, but I'll let Cedric go first. Cedric.
Hello, yes, sorry. Thanks, Steve. Yes, I completely agree. I think one of the concerns we had is we want to capture a wide range of entities issuing signed claims or signed statements. And in many cases, in particular, if it's from an organization or an authority or a corporation, I think we want the highest quality of evidence, which means something that is signed and that is still going to make sense 10 years, 20 years from now. And so I think that's one of the core reasons why for claim issuance or statement issuance, we decided we really needed a signature. At the same time, we did not want to commit to one particular PKI or identity system. And so that's why we made the decision to use DID. And we can revisit that choice, of course, but the the motivation for using DID was to provide this flexibility of accommodating many kinds of ways of identifying and a different level of assurance for that. So now having OpenID or OpenConnect has some particular mechanisms that are allowed as for claim issuance. In some cases, that makes a lot of sense. But I believe moving to those systems for every identity used in our system may be too restrictive. The other point I want to make is we made the deliberate decision to adopt a framework like a DID so that we could separate the identity issues, which are complicated and could absorb a full working group, from the supply chain integrity and trust issues. And so in sort of a modular design principle, if we can take anything that exists for identity, we'd rather focus on the supply chain issues, not the identity issues itself. So that was the initial thinking for picking the ID. I believe we really want at least to keep enabling long-lived signatures, at least for some of the claims in the system, in particular those from software providers, for example, or regulators.
Okay, thanks, Cedric. Ray.
Yeah, hi. Okay, so I'm thinking simple model in my mind is with SCITT is we have a hash value of an artifact, and SCITT, the function of SCITT is to connect a semantic meaning of what that is. And somebody says the semantic meaning is this: it is a software product that I am releasing. Well, who is I releasing that, and why do they have the authority to release that semantic concept, linking it to that hash value? Maybe that's a simple thing to understand. As sometimes maybe, as everyone was saying, a weak identity such as SigStore maintains, and that there's a bunch of people working on a open source software product or a library of some kind, and there is no per se perhaps entity doing it. It's just a whole bunch of people, but there tends to be somebody who's or some group that is saying, okay, this is the thing that we're producing here. And the problem there is like in other cases, it might be like what we're working on here, which is election data, where that government entity is going to be around forever. But those people are virtually forever. Those people who are releasing the software, open source software thing, may not be around, may not want to be identified in any way that they could be maybe subject to any kind of persecution or prosecution if something should happen to their module used in a car being driven by software or something, and someone dies. So there's a couple of issues that I see that are different from the normal use cases of OpenID Connect, which is just to identify someone so they can log into my system. Here we want to both allow for some persistence of identities and also to disconnect potentially people from individuals, okay, from it, and yet have the software product, linked to, like if it is a formal software product from something like Microsoft, then you see Microsoft, you see software product Windows. Okay, I recognize that, and it's owned by Microsoft. And so then in your mind you say, well, they have the authority to do that. So I don't know how we connect. Yeah, the identity is fine. I'm sure we can solve, okay, we can identify this person or this entity, but then the next step is how do we link that to the semantic meaning of that artifact. So I'm probably talked long enough. I see the queue here, but that's what was going around in my mind. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. Dick, you're next.
Thank you, Hannes. So I agree with Ray that we do need to recognize there are different types of trust. And I know at least in our own product in SAG Center, we had to identify what we call trust declaration types. And each one has varying degrees of or factors and criteria that go into, what needs to be verified before an entry can be placed into a registry for a particular type of declaration. So I agree with what Ray is saying, that at some point within this process, I presume the SCITT is going to say we've recognized these types of statements, and each statement will have a set of criteria that will need to be validated by a authorized party before it's allowed to be added to the registry. Thanks.
Thanks, Joyce.
Sorry. Yeah, this is the problem that we always have when we go between sort of the ideal world of everybody can self-attest and make their make their assertions and so forth, and then the ability to trust them in an otherwise a world of unknowns, right? So it's problem I call a source of authority, and I think that it's going to present a problem for us in terms of who runs SCITT. I've been thinking about this actually over the course of the last couple of weeks, but the owner of SCITT is going to be critical to establishing trust, and there's going to be hopefully some kind of gatekeeper that will ensure that the notaries are actual notaries, and the endorsers have some credibility, and then the identity of the individual or the firms that are creating SCITT entries is in fact traceable back to something that's trustable. And if we do not solve that problem, I think we're going to have SCITT's not going to be able to take off, because it's just not going to be practical in that sense. So what I would propose is that we think a little bit about how SCITT is operated as part of these use cases and as part of our process going through here. And maybe those are use cases also, because otherwise, again, we're not going to be able to establish the identity of an individual user. We're not going to be able to establish the bona fides of a firm or an organization, and that's going to leave all of the data basically garbage in, garbage out.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that? I guess I'm kind of throwing that out for discussion.
Rifa, do you have any comments on what has been mentioned so far? It was obviously a lot.
Thanks. This is really helpful. I think Ray helped me a lot to understand the use case, because I was thinking about the end user, and I think mainly my understanding is that you're trying to validate the issuer of that software. There is not specifically the user there, which is slightly different from like a typical OpenID Connect use case. Is that the case? Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, is that at least this is the way I understand OpenID Connect. This is used by people like platforms on the internet to allow people to log in and say, for example, use my identity from Gmail, something like that, or from Facebook, and make it really easy for users to come on board. These people have been somewhat identified, but let's face it, it's a very light type of verification of the user. But so here,
sorry,
Yeah,
Just
sorry,
one comment. What do you
yes.
mean light verification of a user? Like you can you can authenticate that his credentials, his thumbprint, his like there are so many things that you can validate the user with strong authentication mechanism, right? So I'm not sure I understood that.
Yeah, I agree that you can identify a user, and I'm not an expert on OpenID, but I'm really interested in it, so I'm going to be learning a lot more about it. But so you can get probably other identification of that user and so forth. But if let's take the use case of open source software where maybe there are many hundreds of contributors to this thing, and it gets right now the SIG store uses somebody's Gmail address that they happen to be logged into GitHub with. Now GitHub does not require maybe at some levels some people might require it in order for them to use these things, but from what I've seen, I mean, I haven't had to submit my driver's license to use GitHub. And many times I have to trust developers and so forth that come to me and say, you know, I want to help you with this. And I go, okay, well, I could go through another round. But in the end, you release it. And so you got an artifact that's released. We want to put that in the SCITT ledger. This is a released library of such and such. Now, whose identity do we put on that? It's an interesting question because there's so many people that have contributed. It's not any one person that's going to take liability for a failure. And so it's a very different sort of a thing, even though you may have all kinds of people, you know, very well validated, they're not connected to that. So that's one of the issues. The other one is if it's a company, I don't think it's so much of a problem saying, okay, Microsoft, we need you to identify yourself. They have no problem identifying themselves. And if it's a governmental agency, they would have no problem identifying themselves. So that's kind of like not as much of a problem. So the SIG store thing, like trying to make that a little bit stronger, in my mind, I start to get into these issues that I've just described, which make it pretty complex, and I haven't actually resolved it yet myself. But yes, let me shut up. Thanks.
So just a follow up on this. Sorry, guys. So the SIG store, like you mentioned, you go to GitHub, for example, and GitHub might not enforce a strong authentication, but you should be able to say, hey, if I don't get the strong authentication I'm needing, I'm not gonna authorize that request or whatever, right? So maybe I'm not like I need to read more about that use case specifically, but in general,
you on.
How do you know it's not strong enough? That's the question.
You have, there are, again, with OpenID Connect, there are parameters that will indicate the strength of that authentication. Like you can use a AMR value, or which is authentication method reference value, or ACR values, or a combination of those, right? So there are mechanisms to do that today, right?
Yeah, I think the key point is that there's a difference between what the protocol can offer and how the protocol is used in specific contexts.
Correct.
And if you are unhappy with a given context, then you have to use a different policy and use a different identity provider, right?
Yeah. And is there a document that describes that use case that Ray was talking about? Like just to help me.
Yeah, that was the discussion we had earlier, and there's an architecture document as well. I will send you those. Like once the use case document is submitted.
Okay, I'll take a look at those in details, but dig deeper into them. Okay, thanks.
Cedric.
Yes, thanks. So yes, lots of interesting questions, but I want to come back first to the comments and questions from Ray regarding identifying artifacts and talking about artifacts. I think I'm a bit concerned because I think it's super hard to give a meaning to an artifact or to decide who is trustworthy for an artifact at the SCITT level. And I think we should, maybe some instances we'll be able to do that, but at a generic level, it's problems that are, I would claim, out of scope. In particular, I think unless we look at specific use case where we have much more specific policies, a claim about an artifact is really relative to the issuer. So the issuer decides how to refer to an artifact, decides what to say about an artifact, and that's really capturing a statement about its interpretation or the semantics of that artifact from their viewpoint. And the purpose of SCITT is just to notarize it, to keep track of that, to make sure that not too many random claims are made, but essentially, if a claim is made about an artifact by someone I don't recognize or I don't trust, I should just ignore it as a user. And conversely, I will be waiting for claims that are issued from people that I trust or that are authoritative for that kind of artifact. So if it's a Microsoft firmware, for example, then I would definitely expect a claim signed by Microsoft using Microsoft proper key that says Microsoft claims this is an official release of that firmware. And probably then there will be other claims that will refer to that, saying I'm talking about Microsoft's firmware as identified by Microsoft in that claim. But I think trying to assign a meaning to that firmware without referring to who is defining that firmware in my example, Microsoft is difficult. So of course, I think we can have access control so that, for example, people who need to be authorized to issue statements about firmware that gets into a system. But I see that more like for clarity and to avoid noise that as the basis for authority. The authority comes from the identity of the issuer.
So just to make sure, like in this case, that you describe right now, it's more that the identity that is critical here is not the end user, it's actually the entity that is signing that statement. Is that not the case? For example, yes. Microsoft, right?
Yeah, I think that's the core of the issue. So some statements will be issued by users who may be identified using their an OIDC token, for example. But in other cases, like Microsoft sending a driver, we don't want. We want some other form, probably a classic a signature in that case, because we don't want someone deciding who is Microsoft today, right?
Okay. Yeah, lots of people in the queue here, so let's let them go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key piece here we keep on coming back to is there is an identity that we look at the SCITT ledger to verify that identity is valid. And the validity of that identity might be a weak identity, it might be a strong identity. But it's very hard to make any determination on any information, artifact, binary, or otherwise, if you don't know who's producing it. Because otherwise it's just some random thing that's found on the street, on the internet. It's the identity of it that gives you the context. And there has to be some trust behind that identity to decide how to proceed. And there's different identity types that you use for different document types, right? You don't buy a house with a gym ID. So I think that's the main purpose of SCITT, is to make sure that the information that it's pointing to, the artifacts, the evidence, the SBOMs, and so forth, are produced or attested to by an identity that you choose to trust. We're quite short on time, so I'll yield to others in the queue.
Thanks, Steve. Neil.
Yeah, I like that. I think Microsoft absolutely has trouble identifying themselves. Phishers trick real people all the time because people aren't using good methods. And I think the ones we're talking about here are good, but need to be, there are many entities within Microsoft, some of which are more reliable than others. People get fired all the time. So the use case, the important thing is, authentication is a way for a relying party to decide who to trust dynamically. And so a user-centric ID is is very useful. People build up reputation. Identities build up reputation. So I don't think, I have a sense that SCITT is doing a lot of expectation that there's gatekeeping on the front end, and that you know, once something is up there, people can trust it because it came from an authoritative source. I think relying parties are going to differ on who they trust. We're going to expect retraction of claims and undermining of identities. So
that's the exact point I was making before, Neil. I think that's extremely important. Who's running SCITT? Why is it trustworthy? How does the identity get instantiated? So sorry to jump in on a turn, but
no, go ahead.
Just are in agreement.
Okay. Thanks, Neil. Henk.
Yeah. So we were charting SCITT with trustworthiness in mind, obviously, and we were also trimming it down to the things added in this working group. So things existing are authenticity proofs provided by the nodes that will run anything related to SCITT, and authenticity proofs run by, even at some later stage, probably, depending on distribution and adoption, remote attestation evidence produced by everything creating a claim / signed statement to SCITT. So all of this, of course, is under the assumption that a SCITT running system, a set of nodes, will have multiple ways to prove their trustworthiness, one of them being remote attestation as fueled by IETF and TCG, for example. And of course, other mechanisms like consensus protocols and such. So yes, to address Charlie's point, you have to really be sure that the system that handles the notary aspects and the transparency services are trustworthy by themselves. And then identity kicks in, of course, to identify these nodes, the stakeholders, and also the identities responsible for issuing statements. So again, all this is supposedly fueled by rats sooner or later, but we were keeping that aesthetic set out of scope in the beginning to not overwhelm everybody and to focus on the transparency part and the notary items here first.
Thanks, Henk. We are running a little bit out of time. John, do you want to say a few last words before we have to sort of like close the call?
Yeah, I agree with keeping to time, and these are a few last words. I just wanted to remind people, given the great discussion we just had, which I agree with most of, to keep on track with what SCITT is. And there's a reason why we have notaries and attestations rather than anything else. These are witness statements. And so the strong identity, just to reinforce what's been said a couple of times, the strong identity is who made that statement. But what they're making the statement about has to remain fluid, because we're not going to fulfill our mission of providing building blocks for building other systems if we start intruding on the semantics of what is being said. Our job here is to assert and verify and authenticate who said it. So just be careful. We don't have to go down that really complicated identity route in order to fulfill our mission here and do something useful. So if I say something about Microsoft, my identity is what's important there, not Microsoft's. That's a second step. The other thing that I just couldn't help mentioning is Charlie, you asked a few times who owns SCITT. And I know what you mean, but I'm going to bite anyway. This community here owns SCITT, and we get to define what it is and what it means and how deep the trust relationships go in the architecture. So this is a great opportunity to just prod people that we are looking to seal a working copy of the architecture this week, as well as the use cases. So please have a look and make sure it meets your satisfaction, because we're going to be discussing it a lot on next steps at IETF 116.
Will do. Thank you.
Guys, yeah, we ran unfortunately out of time, so I see we got warmed up for another interesting discussion, and I will drag it to the mailing list. I took some notes on some of the sort of keywords that some of you mentioned. So obviously a discussion started, not the end, on this identity management topic. And thank you, Rifat, for joining us. And hopefully, actually, you will join again so we can continue that debate.
Yeah, I'll try. I'll educate myself a bit more, and hopefully I'll be able to make it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Good meeting.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.